Companies operating in today's global economy really need to get an understanding of the international geopolitical risk landscape. At Infortal Worldwide, we work with our clients on solving risk before it starts. Welcome to the Riskology podcast, where we're looking at managing business risk globally and really understanding the geopolitical risk landscape.
All right, welcome everyone to another episode of Riskology by Infortal, where we dive into the world of geopolitics, risk, and really any issues worldwide that can impact your business here in the United States or as you're doing business abroad. We're excited to have another guest here again with Riskology, and we've got with us today Sam Silverstein. Sam is the founder of the Accountability Institute, the author of 12 books, and is featured in the CPAE Hall of Fame. And importantly, you may have seen him featured recently on the Compliance Podcast Network, where he and Tom Fox have focused very heavily on the role of corporate culture in meeting compliance demands and really in terms of successfully running a business. And so that's what we'd like to focus on today. And so, Sam, great to have you here.
Oh, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for that, Chris, and great to see you as well, Ian.
Absolutely.
And so Sam is an expert in culture and really breaking down how companies can tackle problems dealing with culture. And so we thought we would focus on that today and really dive into what can you do as a company who's operating internationally to start thinking about culture. One of the things that we look at is companies that are jumping into new markets, right? And there may be a surface level understanding of business practices, how people operate, and really what's going on at the ground level. But a lot of times there's a real lack of understanding of how companies operate overseas. And so I thought it would be good, Sam, if you were approaching that situation to sort of break down how you would approach tackling that gap.
So I think it's important to really understand what your culture is. And just to lay the foundation, culture is what's repeated and accepted. So whatever's accepted and repeated in your organization, that's your culture. If it's acceptable to show up whenever you want to show up, that's your culture. If it's acceptable to disrespect people in conversation or action, if that's acceptable, that's repeated. If that's going on, then that's your culture. If that's not acceptable, then that's your culture. So all organizations have a culture. Some have a culture by design. Some have a culture by default. Culture by default is anything goes. A culture by design is where leadership has undergone a continual effort to define the culture, model the culture, teach the culture, protect the culture, and celebrate the culture. And when that's all in place and you have a great understanding of what your culture is as an organization, then when you are looking at international expansion, when you're looking at going into new markets, then what happens is it becomes a practice of understanding what your culture is and indoctrinating in these people that you hire, that you bring into your organization, bringing them into your culture. So it's important to know what is part of the culture locally in a market. You know what your culture is, and then somehow leadership's responsibility is to close that gap. So many times there are things in a local culture that might go against what the culture of the organization is. And this is where it's leadership's responsibility to step up. If you have designed and you are stepping out a great culture, then we need to show the people in this new market that this is how we do it here. And as long as you can connect to that, then it's going to be a great relationship. And so it's okay for an organization's culture to not necessarily be exactly like the local culture in that region. You don't have to give up what makes you unique as an organization.
Yeah, exactly. A lot of great stuff there. Let me just see if I can recap to see if I've got it right here. So an easy way to think about it is you've got the local culture, norms, and customs. You've got the way that you operate and do business here in the United States. And then you've got to figure out how the two can fit together and where there might be gaps in terms of integrating the cultures. What do you think about timing, Sam, in terms of how to approach it with local teams abroad? Do you think right off the bat? Do you think you've got to take a measured approach? What are your thoughts there?
Well, whether you're opening a new organization or a new branch, or whether it's a merger and acquisition, it's about being proactive. So, for instance, we have a tool called the culture audit. It's what we use to analyze and measure an organization's culture. If you've done that, if you've participated in that tool or a tool similar, then you know exactly what's going on with your culture. In a merger and acquisition, it would be important to analyze the culture of the organization that you're acquiring. If you're opening a new branch in a new part of the world, then at that point, it's important to have a team of people that sit down and go, okay, here's some differences in the way people think and act in this part of the world that might be contrary to our culture. And so we need to be aware of that, and we need to have a plan to where we teach how we act, how we treat people, how we work with clients, what excellence is in this organization, how we connect to the community. And all of that is going to be done through the organizational values. So this is where the organization usually trips up or comes up short. Organizations are great at identifying values. They're just not always great at living them. And so a culture is defined by the lived values. Go back to what I said before. If we respect everybody, treat each other with respect, communicate in a positive way, that's our culture. What do our values say about that? So it's important to have an excellent set of values, not excellent values, an excellent set. An excellent set must connect to 4 specific areas. And if you have that, then when you go into a new region, it's about teaching those values. And those values are going to always be about people and how we treat, connect with, and what we expect of each other. And so that's where the focus needs to be placed. So the long answer to your short question is we have to be proactive. We need to have a team of people whose responsibility it is to teach the culture. That comes on top of leadership modeling the culture. And so whoever is running this branch, if you will, this entity in this new geographic area, that leadership at the very top, it is absolutely critical that they are aligned and understand the culture as it's been defined for the organization. Because if they're not modeling it, then everything below them will fall apart.
What I'm hearing here, Sam, especially about demonstrating the culture, but also more importantly, finding a way to teach those values and allow the team, the larger team, to understand those values. And I think that's a perfect segue here for Ian, who's spent a number of years as a professor. And I know you've had some international groups, so I'd be interested to get your perspective on that teaching demonstration part, Ian.
You know, you bring up some super critical things that nobody really talks about. I got to congratulate you for that, Sam. You brought up repeated interaction, what's acceptable. And the first book I wrote was actually on the Middle East, analyzing the geopolitics of the region and from a cultural perspective. And everyone's like, well, what's culture? Because it seems so intangible to a lot of people, but it's actually not. It's repeated norms of behavior that kind of go back and forth. It kind of connects to game theory and things like that. But what's interesting is that every business, every market is embedded in a culture, whether or not people want to admit it. We always think, oh, it's about price and rational choice, customers looking at X versus Y, and products and efficiency, but that's not really the case. It's always going to be filtered through culture. And if a business doesn't understand the culture it's embedded in, you know, all hell can break loose, especially when you get overseas. The Middle East, for example, which I'm very familiar with, you have very different gender norms. You have different attitudes around things like women in the workplace, religion in the workplace, trade practices, employee relationships, just the concepts of time can be different attitudes about a whole host of issues where things would be totally taboo in the West, but are not, for example. And a lot of it just comes down to a lack of awareness. I remember you had Starbucks in the early to mid 2000s tried to break into more markets in the Middle East. And they were looking at everybody drinking coffee and thinking, I know, we'll just bring coffee to the Middle East, which sounds hysterical if you know about coffee culture in the Middle East. And in a lot of places, Starbucks failed because they didn't have a grasp of how coffee fit into the culture. And it's interesting how in Israel, they pretty much failed. And in Turkey, what happened is Starbucks kind of became the hangout place for those Turks who kind of saw themselves as more Western and less traditional as opposed to traditionalists. They would go to, you know, more traditional coffee houses that were single owner, much smaller. And I wanted to ask, like, how does the market and culture perceptions, where do companies, especially in the U.S., where do you think that they miss the boat? Even if it's just within the U.S. itself, you know, you go from one state to another or you misread a market. How does culture affect that day to day?
That's a great question, Ian. And, it's interesting because there is a difference, even in the United States. There's a difference between how business is conducted in New York and how business is conducted in Savannah. There is a difference. But people are people, and I believe people are the same around the world. People want to be respected. People want to be loved. People want to be appreciated. People want to be able to contribute to their environment. People want to be able to make a difference. People want to help others. People want to be their best self. They want to be in an environment that encourages that. So 2.5 weeks ago, I'm in Riyadh in Saudi Arabia, working with a group of HR executives and having these similar conversations. We talked about what's accepted, what's repeated, and whether you show up on time or not. And that's just a silly little example. But several years ago when I was in that region, someone posed the question, so what do you do when a prince continuously shows up late for the board meeting, like an hour late? Because you can tell me, Sam, hey, you got to stop showing up late, but you can't talk like that to a prince. So what do you do? So do you just give up on your culture? Do you just succumb to what's going on in the region? And this is where I think the answer is no. I think what you have to do as a leader is totally understand your culture. And your culture, in my opinion, should be built on valuing people. Because if you value people and focus on your people, they will solve all the problems of the business. They will make sure that the bottom line is where it should be, and you'll achieve it at a far higher level. I don't believe you have to micromanage people. That's my feeling. Now, in this situation, so you know your culture, then you need to know what's the norm in the region, and you need to look at what the difference is, and then you need to stop and say, okay, Ian, Chris, Sam, you guys get together, and you figure out how we're going to bridge the gaps between what's going on in the region and how people treat people and how we treat people. Because the way we treat people better be at its very, very utmost superior level. So that's what has to be done there. In the case with the prince, it was a matter of, okay, so the idea was if the meeting starts at 9, the prince is always showing up at 10. At 9 o'clock, everyone needs to be in their seat at the board table with their board book open, ready to go. So next month rolls around, 9 o'clock, everyone's in their seat, board book is open, ready to go. Prince rocks in about 10 o'clock. Well, when he comes in the room at 10 o'clock, what does he see? He sees every board member sitting at the table with their board book open, ready to go. Next month comes around. He shows up late again. And what does he see? He sees everybody sitting at the table waiting for him with their board book open. Next month rolls around. Prince shows up on time. So there's a certain amount of peer pressure around the culture that can be put in place. But here's the thing. You, the leader, had to recognize what was going on in this market, what is acceptable in the market, but what is acceptable to us for our culture as an organization. And then, okay, how do we get creative in closing that gap? And yeah, everything is simple. It's just not always easy. So yes, do you have to get creative? Sure you do. In Kuala Lumpur, in Malaysia, you have a meeting in a room. You go into the room with the meeting. If it's a large meeting, let's say it's a conference, well, you could have 2,000 seats in there. And then between those 2,000 seats and the stage is a row of these big, plush, comfortable chairs with little coffee tables in front of them. On the coffee table is water and tea and snacks. And everyone comes in and sits down. And then the leaders of the organization have a processional down the center aisle and then sit in these big comfy chairs up front between the people and the stage. Now, to me, I feel that that's saying, hey, we're better than you. You're less than. So I know this is going to go on. So how do you counteract that? How do you deal with that? Well, that's the responsibility of leadership to say, okay, we know this is what goes on in this region. What do we need to do to make sure that our people feel that no matter where they are, no matter what level they are in the organization, no matter what their race, no matter their sex, no matter their education, that they all feel valued and important to the organization. And when leadership is committed to that, they're going to do well. They're going to do well.
I think those are great examples, Sam, and it rings true in terms of having or making sure that leadership is demonstrating what you're looking for in the culture. My biggest takeaway from what you just described is it really comes down to values. What are your values? And if you stick to your values and you demonstrate those values through behavior, that's really how you can overcome a lot of the challenges that really can break down negotiations, businesses. But the key there, taking a step back from that, is truly meaning it. And you've really got to, I think, define that as an organization. What are our core values, and make sure that the CEO of the company is approaching those values the same way as everyone who's on the line, and it's a shared vision. I think that really is a powerful tool to overcome a lot of challenges, even beyond the culture space.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But here's the challenge. You ask a CEO if they live their values, and I guarantee you they're going to say they do. Mm-hmm. You ask the people up and down the organization, and this is part of our assessment. Were the values conveyed to you when you were hired? Are the values brought up in all your meetings? You do connect every decision you make to your values. And except for a small percentage of the organizations, they're not going to say that all that's going on. And because it's like you don't know what you don't know. We call them non-negotiable core values. Non-negotiable. That means it's binary. You either are living them or you aren't. It'd be like, well, Sam, what are your values? Well, one of my values is honesty. Well, how often do you ever lie? Oh, well, I tell the truth about 95% of the time. Well, if I tell the truth 95% of the time, if I tell the truth 99% of the time, I'm still a liar. If it's not absolute, it doesn't exist. It's binary. It's like, Are you a thief? If once a year you steal something, you're just as much a thief as the guy that steals diamonds every week. You're still a thief.
Right.
Maybe he's a richer thief than you. I don't know. But you're still a thief. So when it comes down to the values, the organizations that always score the best on the culture audit, the organizations that have the strongest culture, the organizations where we see their culture is driving their bottom line in an incredible way, are always organizations where the leader, this leadership at the top, is living those values and has set the expectation that everyone else in the organization will do so also, or they will be allowed to go elsewhere.
That's an important point of how far you need to instill the values into the organization and how serious it needs to be taken at every level. Otherwise, it won't allow you to overcome those challenges that we described before. So really important. It's not a case of printing off brochures, putting words on the wall. That's not enough. It's got to be real. There's got to be consequences, and, you have to mean it. And I think that's an important dynamic to bring up, Sam.
And the question that always comes up when we help a team of people in an organization either define or redefine what their values are and create this amazing set based on the standards that we know that work, the question asks, are these where we are, or are these a target? And my standard response is, if you cannot show me where these values are showing up in your organization, in your people, then they're not your values. They must be your values right now. If you put it on the wall and you're not living it, then you're a liar. And nobody wants to work for a liar. Now, does that mean that we're the best we can be? Are we perfect? Of course not. We make mistakes. If we do, we need to fix them and fix them fast. We can be better at living our values. We can improve. And that should be a continual effort. But those values, if we're going to sit down, we need to be able to show where these values are showing up. We need to be able to tell the stories of how they're making a difference within the organization. And if we can't, then we need to step back and reevaluate, are these really our values?
That's a great point. I'd like to follow up on that, sort of the disconnect that you described, because it's something I think that Ian and I run up against in the geopolitical risk space. Let's say we'll take a company that's got a pretty good track record, a pretty solid set of core values that we would say is in a decent place, and it's embedded in the company after years of practice. But all of a sudden, the world around us is changing very fast. And so certain things, especially in the compliance world, need to be taken more seriously and need to be accounted for on more of a day-to-day basis. And that's requiring companies to shift their perspective and also how they're valuing certain core information. And so that requires a lot of education and pivoting. And so these companies, I wouldn't say that they've necessarily gotten it wrong in the past, but they're having to shift. And I think there's some difficulty there. So maybe you can highlight on how a company who's doing the right thing, constantly reassessing their values and wants to sort of bring some other outlooks or values into the equation.
Well, the thing with values is once you start talking about them, you can never stop. If the leader stops talking about the values, then the people realize that they aren't important to the leader. They're not important to me. If the leader's always talking about them, then they're important, which means every meeting that ever goes on within an organization, the values need to come into the conversation. And I mean meetings between 2 people, 3 people, 5 people, 50 people, 1,000 people. It doesn't matter. the values need to come up in some form or fashion, as does the word culture. The word culture needs to come up. We need to be constantly talking about our culture because everyone should be working to contribute to the culture and to protect the culture. So with regards to values, every decision needs to be connected back to the values. And the leader is the person who's going to have to teach this. So when a leader makes a decision, it's real simple. We made this decision because we say that we believe XYZ. And so if we believe XYZ, then this decision was long made before the problem even presented itself or the challenge or whatever the situation. Now, when you start leading like that, you're not just a leader, you're a teacher. And when you're teaching people, then what happens is you're teaching them how to live the values. When you protect your culture by not allowing people to stay in your culture who are not living the values, you're sending a message. You're sending multiple messages. One, you're saying, if you're not living the values, this isn't a good fit. Two, I'm going to protect the culture for you. I'm going to make sure that this culture is a great place for you, each and every one of you. And three, I'm willing to get rid of our top performer who's not living the values because you know what? At the end of the day, not only do I believe in the values, I believe in you, which means I know you're going to take up the slack for Joe or Sue or whoever we just had to let go because they're disrespecting people and our values say that we don't do that here. Now, this is setting a pretty high standard. And I think that some leaders just don't understand that they can set that standard because some leaders have figured it out. You can set that standard. We don't disrespect people around here. We talk to people with respect. Not only that, when we share information and give feedback, we're not giving feedback to pump ourselves up or to make us look good or feel good. We're giving open, honest feedback because it's something that you need to know. Now, if that is set as a value in so many words, and that is being stepped out, that's going to change relationships in the organization. Now, if you allow me to talk disrespectfully to Ian and you allow me to stay, then you've just told everyone in the organization, you know what, Sam's our top producer. He's disrespecting his team, but he's our top producer, so you can do that. Well, now those values don't exist. And that's why I said it's binary. It's you're in or you're out. It's black or white. It does come down to leadership. And here's the thing. At the end of the day, we've worked with a lot of organizations, both domestically here in the United States and around the world. Every time we've worked with a leadership group on their culture and the senior leader is all in and gets it, it's a successful project. And every time the senior leader is not all in, it isn't. It does come down to that senior leader because the senior leader all in will not let you or me undermine the culture of the organization. The culture comes before any individual, any performance standard, any contribution to the bottom line. And when the culture holds that level, when those values are that important to the senior leader, you're going to create a different kind of organization. And whether it's domestically here in the United States or you're working to go global into other countries where there's other local cultures, if that's what you're able to achieve, then that migration into these other parts of the world is going to be immensely easier and probably a lot more successful.
I think you brought it full circle, Sam. That's a great way, I think, to cap it off. And that accountability is so important. Before we close it out, if anyone's looking to find out more information about the culture audit, where can they go?
Well, they can go to thecultureaudit.com. It's pretty easy. They can go to theaccountabilityinstitute.com, and then they can always come straight to me at samsilverstein.com. So we give you lots of touch points.
Perfect. Well, we loved having you, Sam. And if you're looking to build your operations overseas, we are here at Infortal ready to help and ready to assist with that journey. And we absolutely think that culture is fundamental to all of that as well. All right. Thanks for joining us here at Riskology by Infortal.